do you do the right thing is compliance. Do you do the right thing every single day? That's maturity. And then you introduce somebody like me, and I break all of that because it's not actually effective. So the analogy I use is when you think about security on your house, right? You're in Oklahoma, so you probably leave your doors unlocked. If you did that in downtown Chicago, right, it's probably not a great risk decision. But here, it might be completely fine. So compliance is going and locking your door because somebody said everybody should lock their door. Somebody walked into the house, right? Maturity ends up being, do you actually check that you locked your door every single time? And then effectiveness is, did you lock the window? Because somebody's coming through that. Right? The enemy gets a vote in everything. And when you think about it from the perspective of compliance, maturity, and effectiveness as a journey, you always bring it back to the most important thing is that what you do continues to happen because you're all critical to our American way of life. If you can't continue to manufacture that part that goes into a weapon system, we may not have that weapon system when we need it. Right? You're literally that close to the warfighter. You're that close to our national security imperatives. And if we can't continue to give money to you and we can't secure the data to where China doesn't copy everything that we build, then our way of life is going to be impacted, and you guys play a critical role in that. So when I think about resiliency, I think about it in big terms of, are we resilient against the types of attacks across all 5 domains of warfare that our adversaries would put upon us? And then, are you resilient at a business level? Are you going to be able to make payroll next week if I come and tell you it's going to cost you $200,000 for the CMMC assessment? Right? We can't lose sight of what's happening in our living rooms and our front porch just because we're thinking about a larger problem.
So that you bring up a great point about, if I lived in Chicago versus living in Oklahoma City, and do I lock my doors? Do I not lock my doors? That's a very physical assessment you can make, right? You can say, this looks like a bad part of town, maybe I should lock my car. This looks like maybe not such a bad part of town, maybe I'm okay. So it's a very easy to not easy, but it's easier to discern what that risk might be. How do you think about that in the cyber terms of the cyber adversary? Doesn't care if you live in Oklahoma, Chicago, LA, Des Moines, Iowa, right? You're equally vulnerable, and geography is irrelevant in this domain.
Yeah, you're spot on. The front line has come to your front porch, right? Now warfighters are everybody. You don't have to be wearing a uniform to end up on the new front line for freedom. Right? So I think about it in terms of, with physical, we're used to it. We're able to determine our level of risk. Even with the financial markets, we had 2 of the largest bank collapses happen very recently. Right? People are reacting to the recognition of that risk. And the general and I were talking before we came up on stage, and talked about our time, living in the world of classified data. And we knew about Huawei 10 years before the public was told, hey, you shouldn't be buying that, right? So the reality is, not only is the front line coming to your front porch, but you are not really in a great position to assess the risk that you're facing. Advanced persistent threats are probably already on most of your networks, right? And you don't know that.
So explain advanced persistent threats to those who may not be
Sure.
steeped, because I think that's an important concept.
Yeah. So everybody thinks, not everybody. There's a significant portion of the business community that believes that their determination of their effectiveness on their cyber program is whether or not they've been breached and ended up in the newspaper. Okay. Who assesses their cyber program based on that? Anybody want to be willing to raise their hand for that one? The reality is, advanced persistent threats will land on your network and will stay there in perpetuity. They're not going to take actions on the objective as soon as they gain access. People are doing ransomware, as an example. They may have a near-term financial objective. They're able to do that. They, send the information. We're ransoming your items. We've encrypted it. We'll give it back. All that nonsense. Those same tactics of gaining access and being able to access that data. Advanced persistent threats are thinking larger. They're thinking geopolitically. They're attacking places like Colonial Pipeline as a warning shot, saying we're going to invade Ukraine. Don't start to engage in support of them, or we'll take down the next 5, 10, 15, critical infrastructure organizations that are similarly situated. And they already have access to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a warning order, right? First of all, it's it's a probe, right? Can I do it? Then once I figure out that I can do it, now I'm messaging to you that not only can I'm willing to do it, and I'm willing to do it at a much grander scale if you don't comply with what I want. So it's a form of ransomware, or it's a ransom methodology that sort of flies in the face of integrated deterrence, which our national security strategy, national defense strategy talk about.
Yeah, you're spot on. I mean, I think there was some feedback. Everybody, who knows what my background is, they typically come to me when anything happens geopolitically. So there was an announcement that President Biden went over and met with Putin, and he said, "Hey, don't attack these sectors," right? And they're like, "Well, why would he do that?" And if you're on whatever side of the political aisle you land on, you're going to say things like that. The reality is those 16 sectors are not a secret. They're printed on the website. If you Google national critical infrastructure, it identifies all 16 of those sectors. So going over there and perceiving it as giving them a list of things not to target is legitimately open source information that everybody has access to. Who makes up those sectors, right? That's easy to know. You can go on fpds.gov and look up your company and the contracts that you're on and use that to target you. And all of this information is readily available. So once we've made it easy for advanced persistent threats, these are near peer adversary level capabilities when we talk about cyber. Then it doesn't necessarily have to be Russia or China. We were talking about that. Some of our allies, right, have some of the most sophisticated intelligence operations going on in the United States. Why would that be any different in cyber? Right? It's not. It's just.
I would say it's actually easier in cyber, right? Because the plausible deniability, the obfuscation, the ability to move around other people's networks, either undetected or anonymized, is much higher.
Yeah.
So it exposes vulnerabilities to our national security fabric that are broader than typically what we think about in the kinetic space, right? I can see the enemy, he or she's got more tanks and planes than I do, I'm worried about that or I'm not worried about that.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the 5 domains of warfare briefly.
Yeah.
Think about space. I contrast that with what happened with the Russian jets that, tried to dump some fuel on our drone and then subsequently clipped it. Think about all the things that are happening in the space domain on a daily basis and how connected space is to our way of life, our day-to-day operations. Whether it's how the UPS driver finds your house, or whether or not our weapon system makes it to the target, all of that relies on capabilities that exist in the space domain. And how many of our satellites have been lost because debris contacts, or it randomly lost power, right? Because there's no blood and guts associated with that, we don't think about it on a daily basis. And that's the same thing that cyber is subject to.
You bring up a great point too, because so much of cyber passes by through it with space, right? Because space is a giant communications transport layer. So every time you go to the Walmart and you use your credit card, it's using GPS time, precision navigation and timing signals so you can get your credit card and buy your gallon of milk. But if you think about what happens if we lose all of that and what kind of chaos ensues, and the other thing I don't think that's well understood, and you may have a different view on it, if you do, please take me on, is that, we talk about space, but 80% of space really happens on the ground. Right, it's the data that moves around, it's the physical infrastructure that moves around, that talks to the satellites at the appropriate times.
Yeah, I would challenge you that 80% seems like a low number. I think with what we saw happen in Ukraine with Starlink, and I think that overemphasized the actual utilization of the space domain in effective communications. Right now, if we took out elements of the global information grid, or just attack ground stations or even utilities that support them, we're 3 days away typically from the infrastructure that allows for resiliency no longer functioning. And that's a scary prospect, right? You have a family member that's in the ICU. It takes 3 days before that loss of power tied to a transportation network means that they no longer can sustain life.
So just to make you more nervous, right, to scare the audience a little bit, think about what happens when all of your medical records are digitized, and your provider can't get access to your medical records. So now he or she is doing basically battlefield medicine, right? He or she's doing triage, trying to figure out what's wrong with you. If they don't have a medical history with you, you can't order pharmaceuticals. And in many cases, and we'll touch on this more with the infrastructure piece, the facility itself won't work right. The HVAC systems, or the data monitoring systems.
If you end up in that scenario, find yourself a special forces medic. They're probably the only ones that can function without the support of the technology infrastructure in the medical world now.
So, I mean, these are very practical things that hit home, but so, and I'll draw your attention to the national security strategy from November of last year. There's an entire lengthy paragraph devoted to securing cyberspace, and I'll just read a little bit to you from it. It says, our societies and the critical infrastructure that supports them, from power to pipelines, are increasingly digital and vulnerable to disruption or destruction via cyber attacks. Such attacks have been used by countries such as Russia to undermine countries' ability to deliver services to citizens and coerce populations.
Sound familiar?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like watching a movie. However, that's the universe we live in. So if we go back to the notion of cyber resiliency and we sort of look at what the NIST talks about in terms of anticipating, withstanding, recovering, and then adapting. And for the business leaders in here in the room, what's your advice to them on how we anticipate, right? What are the things that they can do today to drive down some of these risks, assuming that everybody's living in Chicago, right? How do they drive down those risks? And then how do they know what's good enough?
Yeah, I think we're standing, kind of from the perspective of, we need the GPS system to be able to function in society, and you similarly need the underlying capabilities that enable GPS. So, does anybody done any land navigation with a good old-fashioned map, right? So you end up with
who all the military folks are in the room, right?
Yeah. So in the military, we have the military grid reference system. The rest of the world uses latitude and longitude. But right now, you just plug in IHOP or Starbucks into an app, and it takes you there. You need the same thing to understand where you stand. So if you don't know where you're starting, you don't really know how to get to where you're going. And that process of just having the established baseline of where we stand, and then being realistic about where you're going to go, is head and shoulders over where most organizations are today. Any of you deal with vulnerability management? Anybody want to raise their hand? And
one or two.
You can typically see the look of dismay on their face and tell they deal with vulnerability management. So the way everybody does vulnerability management is wrong. Right? Everybody does it, they do a scan and they're chasing these 78,000 vulnerabilities that are on their network. The problem statement with that is, so what? Like, technically, this water sitting up here this whole time makes me susceptible to being roofied by the general. Am I concerned about that? It doesn't look that shady, so probably not, right? It's the same thing with risk management. The fundamentals of risk management is you first must have something that you care about. You must have an asset that you're trying to protect. If you're chasing vulnerabilities or coming up with threat scenarios, but you don't know what you're trying to protect first, then you're starting from the wrong point and you'll never be able to find your bearings again. That triangulation that you do in land navigation, you need a framework, right? The latitude, longitude, or the military grid reference system, or something along those lines. Typically, a framework, something like the NIST cybersecurity framework or ISO 27001 or something. Really just so you have something to measure against. Something where when I say X, other people can interpret what X means. Once you've figured out what's important to you, you need to go and look at what your design basis threats are, right? What are the threats upon which you are going to design your program? And you mentioned I taught risk management. I taught risk management to people who are protecting ICBMs, and critical infrastructure, nuclear bases, those types of things. And when you teach it to those people, it becomes very real for them and they pay attention. Most times you talk risk management, people convolute that with threats or vulnerabilities. So this concept of a design basis threat is literally like when you do a building code. Any of you in here, emergency managers or former fire department people, they have the most sophisticated understanding of risk of anybody that I've ever met, because they realize that the height of buildings and the code enforcement needs to tie to the length of the ladders in the fire trucks. And the wrenches that they put on their trucks matter for being able to open up the fire hydrant and put out the fire. And they've built all that capability around risk in blood. Because people died because they didn't do that. You need to be able to establish what those design basis threats are for you. And unfortunately, if you're in the defense industry, those design basis threats are not ransomware actors. They're not 12-year-olds sitting in their basements in Chicago. I keep picking on Chicago because one of my team members here happens to be from there. But you're dealing with the best in the world that are coming after you. And if you're back here bickering around whether or not the C800-171 alpha requires you to actually perform a risk assessment or a vulnerability scan.
So if that was Greek to you, that's the National Institute for Standards and Technology guidance that talks about cybersecurity. So if you don't know what that is, go look that up.
Yeah, so I unfortunately am subject to Dunning-Kruger. If you guys aren't familiar with that, it's basically the amount of time I've spent doing this makes it to where I can't really assess whether or not I'm speaking Chinese to you. Okay. The reference I gave, so NIST is an agency, it is not a framework. First of all, if you can take one thing away, write that down. It is a federal agency under our Department of Commerce. It is not anything other than that. They write a bunch of paperwork, right? It's supposed to tell you how to live your life, how to run your business, and do all those things. The one I referenced is the assessment criteria for systems that are housing government controlled and classified information in non-federal systems. Not to be confused with 800-171, which is the controls they're telling you must put into your non-federal system. Okay. And that's an important distinction, okay? Because that also does not have anything to do with your business. It has everything to do with the government's data. Okay. Nothing in any of those standards, CMMC, 800-171, 800-171 alpha, these publications, cares whether your manufacturing organization that supports our defense enterprise exists 2 months from now. All they care about is whether the data they gave you is protected while you exist and gets properly destroyed if you go out of business. So that's why I say compliance is it's a part, like a step on the road, and it's really for business development. You need to get way past that in order to run an effective program. I'll get off my soapbox around that one.
Well, this is important because, if I'm a small business person or a medium-sized business person, I'm faced with this bewildering variety of threats, complexities. How do I get started? What do I do now, right? I know enough to know that I don't know enough. What do I do? And if I work in the defense universe or the national security space, somebody's probably uttered the dirty four-letter word CMMC at me a few times, and I'm not, So maybe let's pull on that thread a little bit. So first of all, I'd like maybe your view on CMMC, and is that effective, or does it provide at least an initial stepping off point for businesses to build a framework for themselves?
Remember, I used to assess programs for DoD. So anytime DoD says you must meet all of these requirements, it's a little bit like do as I say, not as I do. Yeah. Actually, it's a lot of it like do as I say, not as I do. CMMC is just checking. They watered it down so much. Now it's just checking whether or not your SPRS score, your 800-171 controls are really in place. So
let's do a survey here. So who knows? If you don't know what CMMC is, raise your hand. And this is we're all friends. So I got a couple. All right, there's a few more honest souls. The Cyber Maturity Model Certification or Cyber Model Maturity Certification.
Yeah, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification.
Yeah. I got the right words, always get it wrong. That's because I have a Louisiana public education.
Yeah. So it's not about cybersecurity. It's not about maturity. It's really not about a model per se for implementing compliance in your business. and there's no certification. So
Other than that, it's great.
it's a great acronym. I think it started with great intentions. The problem is the way that the government does contracting does not align to the way that compliance is met. Yeah. Is everybody here familiar with the CAGE code? Yeah. So CAGE, right? Most of your organizations, if you do business with the Department of Defense, you have multiple CAGE codes. And a contract is awarded to that CAGE code. And every one of those CAGE codes needs its own SPRS score. You guys familiar with SPRS? That's the CMMC self-attestation where you have to meet all the requirements and you get some score. And most of us are in the negatives. Yeah. So the point there is the way you support, you have technology support your business is not the way the government contracts, and they must do the assessments in the way that they contract. So you as an entity, you may end up being subject to dozens of audits of the same information systems. Okay, think about the burden that puts on an organization.
Absolutely.
Particularly, I'm going to throw out there the most interesting use case I've found. Global enterprises that have high CMMC requirements, CMMC level 2, so it's not just federal contracting information, it's all 110. And they have export compliance requirements when they're doing global work with non-US citizens. So that's a particularly interesting use case, is they have these locations overseas, and they're gonna have a certified third-party assessment organization when they come over and walk around. Like, yeah, the guy's not a US citizen. Yeah, obviously. You're not gonna be able to do that type of work without it. And the other one I think is really interesting, particularly for Oklahoma, are tribal 8A enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to stay under the small business standard, they don't just need a new CAGE code, they need a whole new company. And the certified third-party assessment organizations are over there like licking their chops.
So some of my other industry friends have opined that CMMC is really a revenue generating tool for these third-party organizations that come into your business and say, you're doing well, you get an A+, you get a B-, et cetera, right?
Yeah. And it's the same time they come out with the DoD zero trust strategy, and they're talking about that. They come out with this concept of a data-centric security. So you have human-centered security and data-centered all happening at the same time, and it's like, yes, go deep. It's a very interesting and comical approach to something that is really just supposed to be risk management. Effective risk management solves all of this. If you have government data that you're required to protect, meet those protection requirements for that government data. If you've got people who have access to systems, minimize their access so they have least privilege and assumption that they're not really who they say they are. And these things really end up having to overlay and then be implemented maturely just to make it somewhat effective against an advanced adversary that the defense industry is really facing.
So I'm gonna, with my Louisiana public education, I'm gonna try to read back what I think you just said. What I think you just said was, the stuff I have to do to protect myself, my business, is fundamentally different than the stuff I have to do to make the CMMC universe happy.
Yes.
So I really am having to, pay two bills, if you will, to have a level of cyber resiliency, I'll call it technical cyber resiliency and capability and maturity. So I have to pay that bill and I have to go over and pay the CMMC bill to keep the DoD and the federal government happy, so I can continue to participate in the federal government contracting ecosystem. Is that fair?
Yeah, you're spot on. And that's why I started this with who's here for BD, because if you want to have a CMMC conversation, it's about business development. It is not about a national security imperative. You have a business need to address CMMC so you can win that next contract. So you can give them your 110 SPRS score that is definitely never ever made up, and then actually build an effective cyber program. Those are two separate things. And in most organizations, and here's a dirty little secret about certified third-party assessment organizations, almost all of them, all except for one, failed their audit and had to go back to the drawing board in order to be able to pass and become a certified third-party assessor. And you know what they did to meet those requirements? They said, this is not the droid you're looking for, and they set up a new environment with no users in it, because that's the only way that they could meet all of those NIST 110 controls.
So, I'm sitting in the audience over here and I'm becoming increasingly despondent listening to you.
I'm a lot of fun parties.
Yeah, but this is the guy you want at your party, so let's don't lose sight of that. So if I'm a big defense contractor, if I'm a prime, I got this, right? Because I've at least got money to throw at it.
DoD has lost my records so many times.
Oh yeah, I get a letter every so often saying they've lost my records. I just had to redo my security clearance. I just sent in the letter to the Chinese and asked for it back so I could throw it there.
Here's the downside of this. Like, unfortunately, it's guys like me and the general who make up the staff at most of these large defense contractors. And I'm going to say that, you know, we are national security focused. We care, obviously, about this country and our success. And unfortunately, because of the requirement for, you know, high-level security clearances, we're missing a lot of innovative capabilities in these large defense contractors. So we say they got it, and they've got more money, and they're putting resources towards it, but DoD's got more money than everybody, and they keep leaving ports open.
Exactly.
So it doesn't actually mean that they're going to be in a better position.
So I think maybe that's a better way to put it. So a defense prime has money and resources. They can move further down the path. Not that they're any closer to nirvana, they're just moving down the path. But if you're a medium or small company, this is bewildering. This is all gibberish to you, and you don't have the money or the staff to do any of this.
And we're two years in. Yeah, there's a reason that nobody's moved on it, because nobody believes that it's actually going to happen. And they're like, well, once it actually happens, I've got, you know, political advocates, I got the congressperson's number, I'm gonna call them like, hey, they drug this along for 2 years or 3 years, or whatever it was, and it never happened. So I can't survive paying potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of additional dollars for years before I can see a return on that investment if I'm a small defense contractor.
So I sort of set you up in all fairness, because this is a conversation for us as ODIA and as members of the national security infrastructure. Right? These are the kinds of things that we know we need to do in the sense of there are persistent threat actors, there are attack surfaces that are exposed, there are vulnerabilities, et cetera, We know this, right? We all know this. That's why your iPhone gets updated every couple of days. So we know this, but the flip side is that the conversation that we've just had for the past several minutes has basically said, great, but you're doing all of this stuff to make a government regulator happy that costs you a lot of money, that doesn't add value. So a lot of businesses, I think, are making a decision that says, I can play in the commercial space or the defense space. The commercial space, I know what it looks like. The defense space comes with all this burden, this CMMC and other kinds of cyber burden that I've got to do. I'm just not going to be in the defense business anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
and that hurts the nation, and it hurts industries, and it hurts.
It absolutely does. And here's the sad reality. Like, I am the CEO of a cybersecurity company. We built a software platform. We're the fastest growing company in one of the largest states last year, and we've doubled in size since then. There's this whole financial apparatus around companies like mine that says you need to not go into the defense space, because that ends up increasing costs, becoming more complicated. Private equity firms, venture capital, they're like, hey, your exposure in DoD is small, right? And if I wasn't a guy who spent my entire career in national security, I would not be wasting my time. I would not hire all U.S. development team. Like, literally, like, we hired the Department of Defense chief software officer. He left DoD and came to us. He's a lot more expensive. I can hire an army of 40 people in Costa Rica. But instead, all U.S. citizens, all U.S. base becomes an imperative.
Right.
That is potentially at odds with conventional business wisdom.
Exactly. So you took the bait, which is exactly what I was hoping for, is to paint this tension between, I'll call it good cyber hygiene for businesses, and the imposition that the government puts on the defense industry to meet certain criteria that is an active disincentive for people to be in the defense industry. And I used to see this problem when I was still in uniform every day. One of the things I did in my last job is I owned the $9 billion a year P&L for the global supply chain for the Air Force. And I ran across vendors every day. I needed a part for an airplane or for something for NASA or for the Navy. And vendor would say, I'm getting out of the defense business. I'm a patriot, I'd love to make parts for your thing, but I'm not going to do that anymore because of some of the conversation we've just had. So I think for us, one of the takeaways is how do we as ODIA, how do we as citizens of Oklahoma, how do we as national security practitioners think about what we need to be pushing for inside of the federal government to ask for the right, if we're going to be regulated, let's be regulated in a way that makes sense, that adds value, that delivers some cybersecurity on the back end of it, that isn't I'll call it, this is just my phraseology, kind of a feel-good activity that costs a lot of money but doesn't necessarily deliver a whole lot of, I'll call it, business value.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, additional standards, regulations, and verification significantly trail the broad realization of risk. CMMC is our fault. It's all of our fault. The entire defense industrial base that said we absolutely are meeting that DFARS clause. We're absolutely meeting 801.781. And then it takes about 3 days for China to roll out their version of the F-35. It took us 20 years to get out of the meeting. It's our fault. If we own that it's our fault, then we might be able to do something about it. I'm not a proponent of attacking the businesses that said, hey, we have this core mission, we have this function that we're providing, but I assume that the guy who's telling me that we're good, and let's get these things shipped out of the gate. We need the small business that's scrappy, right?
Amen. And to your point about innovation and who you hire, the 20 or 40 people from Costa Rica versus onshore, and to have that nimbleness and the agility, particularly for coding, it's really essential, and that you typically don't find that in the bigger industry. You find that in the smaller or bigger businesses more than small ones.
Absolutely, we're not going to. And I'm in cyber, right? It's in the name, right? In cyber, there's this marketing nonsense around 3.5 million unfilled jobs. When I go into most large defense contractors, they've got about 4 people trying to run an entire cyber program for a 30,000 person enterprise. We've done the analysis already. We know what it takes. It takes 52 people to run a compliant, mature, and effective cyber program when you're dealing with nation-state EBTs. 52 good people. When most of them are operating with 4, or 3, or 2, or 1, the odds of success are very, very low.
Yeah.
But you can't afford to hire 52 people. And even if you did, there'd be a huge gap. So you think about the open positions in relation to that 3.5 million number. They don't hire for 52, they're hiring to backfill one of those 4. And it's still 3.5 million. We have a significant problem with it takes way too much to run a resilient cyber program. So that's what we've been attacking. Mm-hmm. The government is moving on things like, they did the continuous diagnostics and monitoring program. They couldn't get out of the gate with that, with just knowing what's on the network. They wrote the continuous ATO memo. Anybody familiar with an ATO? It's like colonoscopies. Yeah. That is the most invasive you will ever see, and FedRAMP, it's the Federal Risk and Management Program. I forgot what the A is now. Yeah. But essentially, it's for cloud-based services. They're the only part of the government that does an authority to operate process and enforces the entirety of it. Everywhere else, it's like, hey, if I want it, I'm going to get it out of the gate. If I don't want it, I'm going to drag my feet for 3 years. But this continuous ATO, the continuous validation mechanism, is a concept that we've spent billions of dollars on in the federal government, and they have not gotten to a point where it's even broadly adopted to get into continuous monitoring. They're still, most agencies are spending tens of millions of dollars just having somebody go and check whether or not they updated their policy last year. So there's a major gap here, right? What it takes, the perceived need, and even with all the money in the world, how far they've been able to get. we're gonna have to get on the same page that if we're in the defense industrial base, we are national security practitioners regardless of what your business does.
And say that again, because that may be the most important phrase you utter all day.
Yeah. We are all national security practitioners regardless of what your business does. If your business fails, it impacts our national security negatively. If the way you do your business exposes critical data, then it impacts national security. It's a 360-degree view. And here's we were talking a little bit about sources of intelligence earlier. Anybody here from a power company? Anybody from the energy sector at all? So
we have one pseudo confessor.
So think about the amounts of oil and gas that gets transported from one location to another. It seems like it's a relatively innocuous thing. It's something that if you're in logistics, you're not thinking about protecting that data. But what an adversary is looking at is, how does that oil and gas movement look during training exercises or during real world events? And that becomes part of an intelligence picture that you take, the amount of power used in the homes outside of a military installation versus the volume of gas that's used, outside of Fort Hood, Texas, versus how much money is spent on credit cards at bars, or how many people end up joining those weird adult, married people dating sites that, for cheating on your spouse. All of that information ends up becoming part of an intelligence picture for our adversaries to say, this is real, and that's the warning. That's the indicator of the U.S. taking potential action, or moving resources, or launching that submarine. All of that information we don't think is critical to protect, but it all has significant intelligence value. And don't get me started on social media, because I was told I'm not allowed to talk about TikTok.
So you're painting a picture that's very realistic, but also very frightening, right? The way we lead our lives is a huge treasure trove of information for those who wish to do us harm, not just inside of our own individual business enterprises that we engage in, but when you take each one of our business enterprises and our own personal lives and you aggregate all that together, it makes a Picasso painting, right? It makes an exquisite painting that anybody that takes the time to look at it can discern what we're getting ready to do. And oh, by the way, we do this to our adversaries, et cetera. So this should make you nervous about what is your business transmitting or not, what are you transmitting or not, and how do you sort of tighten that up. Before they get too despondent and run out of the room in tears, I want to pivot just a little bit, because I loved your national security practitioner, because I very much believe that we're all in the national security business. Good economics, sound economics is incredible national security. And so when you talked about the number of people you'd have to hire to manage your programs, obviously companies won't do that for a variety of reasons we talked about. Where do you see, or if you see it at all, the opportunity for AI to participate in that space, to buy down some of the human capital risk, or human capital expense, I should say, that you described, and the number of people that ought to be hired?
Yeah, so everybody's talking about ChatGPT now, right? GPT-4 and all of that. We don't even have to get that advanced to see some significant value out of AI systems. And here's the rub. Anything that you teach in a checklist format, like you apply it to a human and say, follow these steps. That is an opportunity for some elements of AI to perform that activity without the need for the human. This concept of a knowledge worker, you guys are all familiar with it, right? There's the knowledge workers and there's frontline workers in this concept. They used to be called white collar, blue collar, right? But the frontline workers were never going to be able to lose them, right? This knowledge worker concept, I would bifurcate that. There's knowledge workers that are legitimately knowledge workers. They are adaptive problem solvers. They show up, They take data, they make sense of it in ways that other people would not. I wouldn't be able to program the AI to. I'm thinking innovatively. I'm getting emotional context as well as context from the physical and technological world. Those people are probably safe, and our job is to make it to where those people are force multiplied. And then there's the knowledge workers that are not actually knowledge workers. They show up and they say, give me explicit instructions about what you want me to do. And for those people, I use them 3 times. And if we do it the same way 3 times successfully, AI can do it. So we actually do that in my business. We've more than doubled in the past 6 months. And we've actually been able to reduce headcount in what I would consider to be non-knowledge workers, right? To where we can take those people and we can actually make them into adaptive problem solvers. We can invest in them and not just have them be, show up at 9 o'clock, leave at 5 o'clock, do my checklist and go home. So there's an element of value creation that happens with AI, and then ML is just the way to do that at scale.
Yes, the iteration piece.
You instead of me saying, hey, did you do that 3 times the same way, and yes, we got the same outcome. ML does that. That's the way we address the resource gap, but it always requires somebody to come up with that checklist. It requires somebody to evaluate whether or not the outcome that you're seeking is actually being achieved.
That validation, that verification piece of you're getting what you think you're getting.
Absolutely. And then, I think there's even the force multiplication piece isn't just put them in a position that they can solve more problems, it's also to better inform their decision making. Give them context and transparency they've never had before, and then connect the dots around risk. So I use the vulnerability management example. It's a great one. If I just took all of that vulnerability data that you're trying to constantly burn down forever, right? These things are never ending. Every Tuesday there's another 400, right? And they don't all have patches, and some of them you would break your system if you applied those. And I know I'm talking a little bit too IT for some people in here, but basically think about you brushing your teeth, right? You gotta brush your teeth twice a day, every day. Some people do it more than that. You gotta floss. Those things have to be done every day. It's called hygiene, right? If you don't do that, you could brush ferociously for a day, 1 time a year, and you would have a worse outcome. That's how most people manage vulnerabilities. So taking it from that reactive perspective, moving more towards a hygiene, you're still not able to keep up. Imagine if you had to brush your teeth 50 times a day. You wouldn't be able to do anything else. That's what vulnerability management is. So if you could take now AI and ML and overlay that and say, I'm telling you what my critical assets are, I'm telling you the types of threats that I'm concerned about, those design basis threats, and then overlay, are we vulnerable to those design basis threats? Is there a public exploit, and is there something I can do about it? And use that to prioritize. You take that picture of 80,000 and you bring it down to 6 that you can actually go action. That's how we gain a competitive advantage against our adversaries. We cut out all the noise, and we do the most important things all the time, and we just do the hygiene items on a daily basis.
So the reason I pulled on that thread, and I'll start to wrap us up in the remaining few minutes, is I really want our audience to think about how can we look at the problem differently, because you just can't run faster. You can't just throw more people or money at the problem, and yet the problem isn't going to go away. It's only going to get more complex as time goes on. So, we're sort of out of time because I just saw Rusty give me the hook, which really is frustrating because I've got a whole bunch more things to look at.
I think we have just 11 hours of content, but I think everybody here would probably lose it in the next 20 minutes.
So what I think I'd like to do is at some point have another session here, and I'd like to talk about national critical infrastructure. We didn't talk about industrial control systems, the energy industry, and the gas pipelines. You touched on the Colonial Pipeline thing at the beginning, but how do these things affect us? What happens if you're a defense manufacturer and somebody turns off your HVAC system, or your CNC manufacturing system, and you can't make that left-handed wing nut for one of my B-52 bombers? I'm going to be really unhappy about that.
Yeah, and again, we're in this. There's the operational technology, and there's the core business function, and there's the reality. If we make it really easy to target, Like, why Colonial Pipeline? Because they were on the network, they knew what would happen if Colonial Pipeline was taken down. All that is completely available with open source intelligence. I would challenge all of you, how much of your critical information about yourself and your business is exposed publicly? I mean, my team is kind of forced me into some of the I lived, undercover for basically most of my career. You end up in this scenario where, hey, this book, we need to get it published, you need to go on podcasts, you do all those things. This is the most uncomfortable thing in the world for me. Everybody else, like everybody's, mom, dad, uncles, aunts that you don't want to, they're on Facebook, they're sharing data, they're taking pictures, they're talking about what they're doing in their lives, they're, look at my first pet died, look at my mother's maiden name and she's connected to me. All of this makes it easy for you to get targeted and exploited. So I would challenge you to think about that, not just in terms of your personal information, but also that of your business, and then compare that against what our national security near-peer adversaries or even our allies at this point would want to get from you. What they would be able to do to specifically target you and exploit the critical function you provide for all of our way of life.
So Lee, we should put this on LinkedIn as far as I can.
No, well, I don't think we said anything that everybody around the world may not have already heard, but yeah, it's stay away from LinkedIn and
They got my
Facebook.
SF-86, my DNA, my OMB data breach, my TSD.
My dental records. Exactly. So you don't have value as a human being, right? Your information has value in this context, right? What do I know about you and your family and your business and your medical history? And there's been a lot of conversation lately about a large company buying another large medical company, a large IT company basically buying a large medical company, and what's the wisdom of that? We could do this for hours, and I don't want people to get too despondent thinking about the risks and vulnerabilities that their businesses face. But I would be remiss if I didn't say thanks to Jeff. Very much. Thank you very much for being here. Thanks for being a part of this. Thanks to our guests from Mexico. Thanks to the sponsors. I think you've got a few minutes. Can you hang around for a few minutes afterwards?
Yeah.
So feel free to rush the stage and tackle Jeff and ask him all the questions that
I'm also a jiu-jitsu black belt, so if you rush me.
Yeah, so you rush him, I'm going that way. Anyway, thank you for being here, and thank all of you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And the next break is the setup.